Mark, thank you so much for joining us. Professor Harvey is here and he's going to talk about celebrity influence. He's author of two books, right? On the
Well,
topic.
one book on celebrity influence, but I've also published some other works in other books and articles and things like that. Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm going to have you just do your presentation and tell us about any new developments with your research. And we're very excited to talk about the influence of celebrities because that's one of the topics in this class, persuasion.
Well, that sounds great. So,
All right, then let's talk for just a little bit. First of all, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm excited to talk to all of you. So I want to start off with this quote here. This is from Larry Sabato. He is a professor of politics at the University of Virginia and director of its Center of Politics. He says, "My take on celebrity endorsements is that the only weak minds they can sway are fortunately not registered voters, or they don't show up at the polls. Very few Americans are empty vessels into which celebrities or the media can pour opinions. Celebrities don't sway any voters with substantial gray matter. I mean, who would vote for someone because Ben Affleck is for them? They'd have to be a blithering idiot. Generally, the blithering idiots are in the movie theaters on election day. Celebrities, most of them couldn't get their spouses to endorse their choice. This is of great fascination to readers of Variety and not to any real people. Thank goodness." So that's where we start off. And this guy, by the way, is a very well-established political scientist. Somebody who studied politics for years. He's very well published, definitely top of his field. And so this is a pretty strong statement suggesting that their opinions, the voices of celebrities don't matter. So I want to know, so one thing I'm curious about, right? I mean, are these celebrities really persuasive? Are we blithering idiots for listening to them? And even to some extent today in the academic community is this really a thing? And does it matter? Am I wasting my time? And I had a lot of people along the way basically telling me I was wasting my time. So keep in mind, there's two basic schools of thought in terms of voting and public opinion. Right, one is that people are intelligent decision makers. That is, it's a rational choice approach. People engage in a kind of cost-benefit analysis, and they make decisions based on what is most rational for them. And Sabato's argument is reasonable from that perspective, right? He's arguing from a rational perspective, right? If I want to vote for person A or person B, or if I want to choose policy A or policy B, or change my opinions, right? It's something that is going to match up with the set of preferences that I have. And the second school of thought is that people are easily manipulated and they can make decisions based on simplistic or even emotional reasons. And there's quite a bit of literature out there in psychological theory that suggests perhaps that would be true. And there's a fierce debate really in terms of what drives people inside that political science literature. So I was looking at examples from history when I was working on this book and thinking, I mean, how influential have celebrities really been in the past? And I looked at a few cases, like for instance, in the upper left-hand corners, you see a picture of John Lennon with Yoko Ono, of course, a former Beatle. He was very outspoken in terms of politics, wanted to speak in terms of peace and all this sort of thing, but also he was organizing with the American left. So we've got Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman in the picture here with him. You know, he was actually living in New York City and trying to agitate and trying to get people organized in order to prevent Richard Nixon from being elected in 1972. As you can imagine, Nixon got elected anyway. And in fact, Nixon waged sort of a personal battle against John Lennon, trying to challenge his immigration status and try to get him kicked out of the country while he was doing this. And so, on the one hand, you can argue Lennon was very ineffective. On the other hand, Richard Nixon was nervous. And so, it's an interesting case, right? Now we have another example. You see the king, Elvis Presley, baby. They're shaking hands with Richard Nixon. And I don't remember exactly when this picture was taken right now, probably 1970, 71 or something like that. This is Richard Nixon accepting Elvis Presley into the Oval Office. Now, one thing that's interesting is that well, first of all, I'll say that when they got together for this meeting, the idea was that Elvis had some concerns about the direction society was going in. He wanted to infiltrate hippie groups and try to convince them not to take drugs, and there's all sorts of things. But somehow he got got basically a meeting with the president. And so the two of them had this discussion, and he was trying to influence Nixon to do certain things policy-wise and let him help out. So Elvis Presley, of course, one of the biggest stars on the planet at the time. But the interesting thing about this, though, is that this wasn't really very influential at all. And the reason why I tell you that is this photo, while taken in the early 1970s, wasn't actually released until the late 1980s. In fact, that meeting was, I don't know if you want to call it a secret meeting, but it's one that was not reported on. And the concern that both of them had is that Elvis Presley thought that his credibility would be harmed if he was seen with Nixon. Nixon thought that his credibility would be harmed if he was seen with Elvis. And so at this point in history, the idea that a celebrity is going to associate with a politician is not completely foreign, but it's like people are a little bit cautious, like, I don't know if we should take them seriously or not. The third picture we have down here is the lead singer of U2, Bono. And I remember this is a shot from a movie called Rattle and Hum, which was their concert movie, which was released back in the late 80s. You know, I remember when I saw this movie, I was quite moved by his expressions. He does a lot of political preaching and, takes a lot of opinions, particularly on the conflict that was happening in Northern Ireland. I was very moved by that, but at the same time, I was sort of rolling my eyes a little bit, like, who does this guy think he is? Is anybody listening, and is anybody taking him seriously? And I would say really all the way, through the 1980s, sure, there may have been moments where celebrities might have had a couple of moments where they're gaining some attention, but I don't think that politicians or society are taking them that seriously in terms of politics. But eventually we come around to a changed political environment, right? So now, not only is it okay for the two of them to be seen together, celebrities and politicians, but it's actually encouraged. It's like it's seen as a net positive for a lot of people. And so my original research question was, why would the powerful desire the company and counsel of celebrities, right? I mean, don't they have anything better to do with their time? And you could see, obviously we've got Bono again from U2 with George W. Bush. We have Barack Obama with George Clooney. And of course, Clooney also standing there, and Julia Roberts with Obama and Joe Biden as well in a much more recent picture here. And anybody who's been paying attention to last year's presidential election knows there's been lots and lots of celebrities coming out and talking, and a lot of appearances with the presidential candidates and celebrities as well. And then we had this that happened, right? So how do we end up getting a celebrity president? And I am calling him a celebrity president because when he was originally elected, he wasn't a public official, right? Most people who go to become president have some experience, right? Maybe they were a governor before or a senator, or they have been elected at some point before. Donald Trump's primary experience was that he was a famous businessman, not even a particularly successful one, but that he had a TV show that made him look like a very successful business person. And using that leverage and that fame, he was able to push his way to the presidency. So how did that happen so suddenly, and how did we get there? So here we are, right? If you want to understand why this may have happened, I'm going to quote Donald Trump himself anyway, in terms of why he thinks this is a new landscape. And this is what he says. I wish I could do a good impression of Trump, but I'm horrible at it. So I'm just going to read it. Another reason that I'm going to win another 4 years is because newspapers, television, all forms of media will tank if I'm not there. Because without me, the ratings are going down the tubes. So they basically have to let me win. And eventually, probably 6 months before the election, they'll be loving me because they're saying, please, please don't lose Donald Trump. And this is him actually talking December 28, 2017. So that's a year into his first presidency, responding to criticism. So if he's right, maybe I should have changed my book cover, right? I've got Bush and Bono on the cover, but hey, maybe I would have sold more with Donald Trump on the front. I don't know. So my question is Trump right? This is a quote from Jeff Zucker. He was the head of CNN at the time that Donald Trump was running for president in 2016. And he said, if we made any mistake last year, it's that we probably did put too many of his campaign rallies in those early months and let them run. Listen, because you never knew what he would say, there was an attraction to put those on the air. And Zucker, he was also the president of NBC Entertainment when The Apprentice was first on TV. That was Trump's show that he was on. He said that even then, Trump was a publicity magnet. He said Trump delivered on PR, he delivered on big ratings. And so, speaking from the head of CNN, there's probably something to Trump's argument. So this leads me to believe that there's something going on with celebrities and power and their ability to persuade. What do we know and what can we prove about them? So there's a couple of areas that I want to talk about. First, issue advocacy. Like I said, that's where most of my research is, and that's what we're going to spend a little bit more time maybe going into a bit of depth on. The second one is candidate advocacy, like what happens when a celebrity endorses a presidential candidate or some other candidate. On the issue advocacy side, my research is based on 3 studies that I did, right? The first, we look at times when celebrities intervene in public affairs. What happens to the news cycle, right? How is celebrity intervention compared to similar actions by politicians? So in other words, we're comparing the ability of celebrities to do the agenda setting to what politicians can do in terms of agenda setting. The second is that I surveyed respondents comparing the perceived credibility on issues and compared politicians to celebrities. So if we take a given issue, is a particular celebrity or a particular politician more credible, perceived as more credible on that issue? And the third was a psychological experiment. So you have people, and the way it works out is I had people read about a political problem or issue or something like that. And I presented both sides of the issue as equally as possible. And then in one group, you let them wrestle with the problem, you answer questions without a clear angle, and you see, all right, people are looking at this objectively. There's 2 sides to this. What side are they going to come down on? What are they going to agree with? And in other groups, I included a pretend quote from a celebrity taking a side on that issue. So it may be that you read exactly the same thing. There's this side and there's this side. But at the end, the thing that is different is that it's like George Clooney says, we should blah, 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 blah. We should do this, right? So then that allows me to measure whether or not George Clooney's statement caused them to move this way or that on that particular issue. And some situations I had him advocating on one side of the issue, in some situations I would have him advocate it on the other side of the issue. Is the celebrity able to persuade the group to agree with him or her? And I'll add one more thing, since I'm sort of explaining to you what that psychological theory or the psychological methodology is that I actually had a third group as well. So instead of having some celebrity basically saying, I agree with this side or I agree with that side, I also had something where I had a noted celebrity and then advocate this or that. So in other words, not any particular celebrity, just sort of like celebrity in general. And the reason why I did that is because maybe you've learned some of these theories already in your persuasion class, but framing is something that's pretty easy to do. You could persuade people by giving people both sides of an issue, and you can have any kind of public official sort of say, like, this is the way that I'm going to interpret what it was that we just looked at, maybe on both sides of the issue, and it has a tendency to push people in that direction when the issue is framed in that way. And what I was afraid of is that, okay, maybe George Clooney can frame an issue, but maybe anybody can frame the issue. So I want a difference between anybody versus George Clooney, right? It's like, it's not just can anybody move somebody in this direction, but can I create a statistically significant difference between sort of blank celebrity versus a specific celebrity? Like, can that person make a difference, whereas the non-specific celebrity could not? So that was important for me, because otherwise we're just recreating framing theory. So going back to the first part, right? So how did celebrities get into, well, this is a little bit of background. I'll just say this first. How did celebrities get into politics in the first place? Because one of my original questions was, why have things changed? And then once we understand why things have changed, then that will help us understand their ability to prime and to engage in agenda setting. So there were changes in the technology, media, and the audience really over the past, really since the 1980s particularly. In the late 80s, early 90s, the growth of cable television, it just grew like crazy, and it reached saturation in the early 1990s. And then, of course, you have the internet. And so this 24-hour news cycle has accelerated demand for more information and led people to what I would argue is a shorter attention span. Like, I don't think that a younger generation now has any shorter attention span, so to speak, than an older generation. But what I do mean is that there are a lot more distractions. There's a lot more devices. And so, if I didn't tell you guys to put your devices away, you might get bored with what I'm saying. You're like, hey, let me look at my phone. Let's look at sports scores. Let's look at social media and all this stuff, right? That's the way it works. And so in order for media organizations to gain people's attention, they have to do something that is going to get people's attention, make them want to click towards something and not ignore it and click towards something else. In the words of Paul Watson, to get attention, you need sex, scandal, violence, and celebrity. The other thing that changed isn't just the media landscape, but also the way that celebrities were being treated by their respective industries. So there were celebrities in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, endorsing candidates. Like Al Jolson was a huge star in the 1920s, and he supported a couple of candidates, although he didn't do so sort of just because he was excited about it. Basically, an ad agency came along and said, hey, can you sing a song about Warren Harding? And that's what he did. There were also celebrities that engaged in the March on Washington in 1963 when Martin Luther King was speaking on the Washington Mall. And at that time, it was a very difficult thing for celebrities to advocate on one side or the other of the issue, in part because they had these legal contractual obligations that limited their ability to do that. So they had these things that were called morality clauses, and the way they were often interpreted is that if a celebrity said or did something that seemed to be inconsistent or against the wishes of whatever studio they were associated with, then they could be blackballed, right? Like, for instance, in the movie and entertainment industry, in terms of movies, film industry, nowadays actors can kind of like freely move from one studio to the next. They have sort of a free agent system. Well, back before the 1970s, there wasn't really a free agent system. It's like you signed a contract, and if you were with MGM held your contract, and you had to do what they said. And if you were to take a risk and come out and engage yourself in something political, then they may not hire you back to do any movies anymore. And that changed a little bit, particularly with the emergence of the Beatles. So you see the Beatles, for example, up here in the upper left picture with some Little Richard and some other African-American artists. And they were a particularly big deal when they came to the United States because they were so huge, they completely changed the way that the entertainment industry operated. For one thing, they were making so much money, it gave them autonomy, it gave them financial independence, and so they could be more outspoken on political issues, which really led the way to a lot of other people feeling like they could do that as well. And in addition, because they were so huge, they could make demands on the industry to change in certain ways. For example, they would say, we are not going to perform in front of segregated audiences in the American South. Well, if that's going to be the contractual policy and somebody wants the Beatles to go down to Atlanta or something like that, then those venues had to integrate their audiences. And so in some ways, the financial independence and their independence from these contractual obligations allowed them to change the industry in more progressive ways. And so by the time that the 1970s come along, actors have a lot of financial and contractual independence. However, it really hasn't ever changed that much for athletes. Like, athletes who come out and speak out mostly are kind of going out on a limb. And when somebody's playing for a team, they're more or less, their contract is owned by the team, just the same as the actors were back in the 1940s. And if somebody does speak out, like you see this picture of Colin Kaepernick, for example, taking a knee against racism, speaking out for Black Lives Matter, he can be blackballed. And that's exactly what happened. They've essentially kicked him off the San Francisco 49ers, and he has not been back since. Now, I find it ironic that just a couple of nights ago at the Super Bowl, you have Kendrick Lamar up there, who was a pro-Black Lives Matter person and an artist who did a few edgy things in his Super Bowl show. But the players potentially get in trouble when they express themselves in that way. So the NFL has changed, but they still don't want their players out there being political. You know, the final picture that you see up here actually is a picture of the Dixie Chicks. And just to illustrate that even musicians who have a great degree of freedom do not necessarily have endless freedom of speech in terms of the court of public opinion. At one point, they said something very simple in front of a British audience against George W. Bush, protesting the Iraq War, and they weren't even that explicit about it. They basically said, we're ashamed that the President of the United States is from Texas. There was a huge backlash in the United States. It's like people are trashing and burning Dixie Chick CDs, and it was crazy. And part of it is because they were country music artists, and that aspect of the industry, country music industry, tends to be a little more conservative. And if they'd been like regular rock or pop artists, probably totally get away with it. But in that particular industry, they could not. So how are celebrities influential on issue advocacy? We talked about how they got there, but what are the factors, in what ways? So one I talk about, which is spotlighting, which is a lot like priming or agenda setting, but it's a slightly different term. And that is that celebrities lead in media coverage. That is, when you compare the two, it seems that politicians are the beneficiaries of appearances with celebrities. Celebrity interventions are more likely to produce media coverage than politician interventions across media types, and more celebrities may increase the effect. So that is to say, if Barack Obama went out and talked about an issue, and compared to sort of George Clooney talking about the issue, there is a difference in terms of how much attention they are going to get for that issue. And if there's more than one celebrity, then it increases the effect. This is a hilarious, I think, headline, like from CNN back in the day. It says, Clooney, senators urge action on Darfur. This was, can't think here. Anyway, so interesting headline. Here's a close-up, right? Actor George Clooney joins Senators Sam Brownback and Barack Obama to discuss Darfur Thursday. That is, the senators are definitely not the headline, even though one of them is getting ready to become the president of the United States. It's George Clooney who's the headline. Or as Jon Stewart once said, the most powerful man in the free world is having Barack Obama over to his house. Here's a chart to illustrate what I am talking about. Okay, so Obama's talking about Sudan as an issue, and he's trying to engage in what appears to be agenda setting. He's trying to prime these issues and trying to get people to pay attention to them. So in March, he's talking about limited oil supplies from Sudan. It's all sort of at this low level. And then George Clooney testifies before Congress, and there's a spike. And George Clooney meets with Obama. And then Clooney gets arrested at the Sudan embassy. Woo! All of a sudden, we have this huge spike in activity as soon as George Clooney gets involved. And it really, as soon as he's not involved anymore, it's sort of back down to this low level. The only exception being Sudan bombs South Sudan, which is a pretty significant political event in itself. I did dozens of media analyses of this, and this is the kind of pattern that we see over and over again. It's not true all of the time, but it's true enough to the point where you can see that when a celebrity steps in, all of a sudden the media starts paying attention to them. So that was the first one. The second one was a question of credibility, right? What I found was celebrities were consistently shown to be more credible than politicians and even presidents of the United States. In many cases, credibility between celebrities and politicians were simply indistinguishable. Among partisans, politicians enjoy an advantage on some issues. That is, like if you have, very strong opinions on sort of polemic issues that are very extreme, the politicians may be more influential on those. But they rank celebrities higher than members of the opposite party. And celebrities may actually be uniting influences. All parties tend to think celebrities are more credible than anybody on the other side. So even if I'm a Republican and I'm skeptical about Democrats, I might actually trust the celebrities more than I trust the Democrats. And so and it's the same thing is true on the opposite side of the aisle. So they tend to be seen as not quite as extreme as the people on the other side. I don't think that's true for all celebrities all the time, which we'll talk about, but in general, that seems to be the case. What affects the credibility of celebrities? In other words, why are they sometimes seen as more credible than politicians? One is their perceived independence from politics. That is, they believe that celebrities don't have the same interest that a politician would, that they are not, they're not seen as corrupt or anything. And so as a result, they tend to trust them more. And that is some of what was happening also in terms of Donald Trump's attraction back in 2016, as they thought, well, you know, he was just this rich guy, right? And so they believe that they're a little more independent. The second one is brand match. That is that certain celebrities can advocate on some issues and not on others. This is really borrowed from the persuasion literature on the marketing side in terms of advertisement. There's a famous study that suggested that Jessica Simpson, who was a famous actor-singer in the early 2000s, could sell perfume but couldn't sell pocket knives. Probably makes sense. And so whether or not they are seen as a match on a certain issue is something that may affect their credibility. Another thing that affects credibility is experience and connections. Okay, so what I mean by that is that sometimes celebrities are seen as having a specific connection to an issue, really through the way that they interact with other groups, but also based sometimes on their personal experience, things that they may have experienced themselves. So, for example, Angelina Jolie has done a lot of work with the UN. That's given some practical experience. Bono has studied international economics with Jeffrey Sachs over at Yale, and therefore is seen as having more experience. And so connections to organizations and experience that translates to knowledge also leads to credibility among celebrities. Then you have this question of identity. For example, if you ask people who's more credible on certain issues, when it comes down to LGBTQ issues like AIDS or same-sex marriage, Elton John and Ellen DeGeneres are among the most credible, high above Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, lots of other people up and down the list. And the reason why that is, it seems, is that they are associated with that issue. It is their personal, it has a lot more to do with who they are as people. And that allows sometimes people to identify more with them and with what it is that they're trying to advocate. Here's another funny one. Willie Nelson. Okay, Willie Nelson is more credible on marijuana legalization than Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, or anybody else at the time. In 2016, more credible than Trump. Why is Willie Nelson more credible? Because he's a pot smoker. I mean, I think it's just really that simple. People associate with him with that issue, and he's an advocate. Don't get me wrong; he has, definitely some experience in that field. But yeah, he's the strongest advocate when it comes to that particular issue. So, in addition to spotlighting and credibility, persuasion is a third way that celebrities are influential on issue advocacy. According to my findings, celebrities were capable of persuasion across two issues: Syrian intervention and same-sex marriage. So when I was doing these studies, it was a time where the United States was talking about whether or not they should should intervene in the Syrian civil war, and same-sex marriage was a really hot issue. George Clooney and Angelina Jolie could convince audiences to intervene or not to intervene on either side of that issue in terms of Syria, which is consistent with what we discovered in terms of experience and the connections findings in terms of credibility. Ellen DeGeneres could persuade audiences to support same-sex marriage, which also is consistent with the identity findings in terms of credibility. Another thing is it's hard to change people's minds whose attitudes are entrenched. For example, Republicans on same-sex marriage, there is no Ellen DeGeneres that was going to change their mind on that, at least according to this study. it seems that the more polarized people are about particular issues, the less likely they are to be moved. So if you're looking at, let's say Taylor Swift decides that she wants to come out on one side or another of an issue, let's say gun control, right? Taylor Swift is not going to be able to convince anybody to give up their guns. Just people are really set in on certain issues. So how about endorsing candidates? We've discovered that some endorsers are more influential than others. If you look at this USA Today poll, the question was, would these celebrities' endorsements influence your decision about who you'd vote for or make you less likely to support their candidate? If you look at the top of the list, there's not a celebrity up there. I mean, sure, Barack Obama's famous, but he also was a former president of the United States. And if you look at who is at the top of the list, it is those people who have had experience as public spokespeople in politics. Now, Oprah Winfrey and Rachel Maddow are not. They're pretty high considering those circumstances, but then we go down to other politicians. Really, for Taylor Swift or Beyonce to be on this list is probably a pretty big deal, but they're not huge in terms of influence compared to a lot of the more conventional politicians, which honestly shouldn't be all that surprising if you're talking about advocacy of candidates, of endorsement of candidates. So what affects votes, right? I get calls all the time from media organizations that ask me this, particularly when election time comes around. You know, some famous actor will come out in favor of a candidate, and they're always like, so is it going to change the election? And now are they going to win? And I always say, well, probably not. You know, what really affects votes are things like the economy, what people's partisan affiliation is, not necessarily endorsements at all. And what I mean by that, it isn't just celebrity endorsements that don't matter. It's actually politicians' endorsements too. I mean, if Barack Obama comes out and supports Kamala Harris, that doesn't necessarily move the needle. I mean, I'm not sure it hurts her necessarily in this case, and it's not to say he isn't influential, but, you know, how do these individual endorsements stack up against like what inflation is like, or what the economy is like, or house prices, or how I feel about the direction that America's going in? And those endorsements are maybe a part of that story, but it's hard to separate those out from all of those larger macroeconomic issues that are going on. And what about Taylor Swift, right? There was a lot of talk during the 2024 election about whether or not Taylor Swift could sway it for Kamala Harris. And the answer is clearly no. I mean, Kamala Harris didn't win. But I actually had some evidence as well. I did a study with some colleagues back in August of 2024. This was right before, about a month before Taylor Swift made her endorsement of Kamala Harris. So what we discovered was, first of all, if Taylor Swift goes out and encourages people to vote, then it makes a difference in a statistically significant way. That is, people are more likely to vote than they were before if Taylor Swift goes out and says, go vote. So she is influential and persuasive in that way. But it changes, though, if she hypothetically says that you should vote for Democrats. So, and this is how it plays out. First of all, the only people who care about what Taylor Swift has to have to say are Swifties. So you have to sort of like, you eliminate everybody else. And then among those Swifties, those people who know who she is and thinks that and care about her, what difference does it make? Well, among those who are Democrats, it doesn't make that much difference at all. In fact, if you look historically, right, there was a Swifties for Harris campaign long before Taylor Swift even got involved and made an endorsement. And so it didn't really make that much difference, you know, in terms of her endorsement, right? They know where Taylor Swift stands. She doesn't have to make an endorsement. And those people are already going to be supportive of Kamala Harris. And they've got people on the other side who are in favor of Donald Trump. And largely speaking, these people aren't responsive to Taylor Swift either. Like, they've already made their mind about Donald Trump, and Taylor Swift is not going to change her mind. So it's the people in the middle where we did find a statistically significant effect. And what that effect is that as Taylor Swift says, go out and vote for Democrats, people are actually less likely to want to vote for Democrats. And so it's possible that Taylor Swift's endorsement of Kamala Harris actually is a backfire, as opposed to something that actively helped. I know that's counterintuitive, right? That's surprising. That's not necessarily what people want to hear or what people expect. Certainly the people who did strategy for Kamala Harris They were super excited to get her endorsement, but based on our research, we suggest that it probably doesn't make any difference at all, or it makes a negative difference, and that's certainly not what they want. So why is it that people on either side don't matter, and why she may be turning people off? Well, first of all, a lot of people have animosity about celebrities telling them who to vote for. And I think more importantly, what it really comes down to is this question of our partisanship, of the polemic nature of this political moment. And it's been this way for quite some time anyway. You remember earlier when I told you about how Taylor Swift isn't going to change anybody's minds about gun control. Do you think Taylor Swift's going to change anybody's mind about Donald Trump? Right? Trump is not an issue, he is a person, but people feel so strongly about him and feel so strongly about candidates on the other side that it doesn't matter what celebrities are going to say, right? You can maybe change people's mind about whether or not we ought to intervene in do some foreign incursion somewhere. We can maybe convince people on certain social issues at a certain point. But, when it comes to really extreme issues, if you're a partisan and you have those strong opinions, you're not going to change people's minds. So, can we extrapolate results from issue advocacy to candidate advocacy as if a candidate is a brand? All right. First of all, they can spotlight, right? I mean, I think that's absolutely true. And if I were to ask the experts, particularly on the Kamala Harris side, why they lined up so many celebrities, it has to do with spotlighting. It has to do with agenda setting. Like, can we get somebody, anybody who's got some attention so we can increase media coverage and basically expand more attention to our candidate? And I think that was the strategy, right? Let's just get more attention to her, whichever way the winds blow. Bottom line is the same thing that Donald Trump was talking about in that quote that I mentioned earlier. Let's just get a whole bunch of people's attention and get the media cycle going and get them excited. And so I think that's the first thing that really does cross over. The second is an area of brand match. We talked about how Oprah Winfrey was influential in terms of getting Barack Obama elected, but maybe Oprah has something that other candidates don't. Maybe there's a gravitas that goes along with her endorsement that maybe doesn't exist for other sorts of candidates. Maybe political endorsers like the Obamas are a better brand match than most celebrities, right? So you have to think a little bit about whether or not there's that match there. And keep in mind that, when it came down to the 2024 election, the Obamas supported Kamala Harris, Oprah supported her, Taylor Swift supported her. I mean, lots of people supported her. Did she win? No. And so it sort of goes back to the literature of what we already know, is that individual endorsements don't make that much difference. I don't think you can argue that Joe Rogan or Hulk Hogan made a huge difference in Donald Trump's election either. Did it increase, did him appearing on Joe Rogan's podcast increase his people's awareness of him and his issues and his beliefs? Did he get people fired up? Yeah, probably so. But I'm not sure that that's a single variable that probably actually made a big difference in the grand scheme of things. Now, I will say there's some of the messaging that Trump did and Rogan did and some of the other so-called bro celebrities in the election that I think may have made a difference, but that's probably the subject of another video when we can talk about sort of the way that masculine images are sometimes portrayed in the media, but that's another story. Experience, right? Maybe Oprah's experience with Congress made her more credible. She had she actually testified before Congress and talked about personal experiences about her abuse, and then used that to leverage passage of a bill through Congress. And so she's had some experience and some association with a certain issue. She's had previous campaign work, so maybe that's one reason why Oprah might be more influential than, say, Taylor Swift. Then there are issues that I call wedge issues, which are those sort of polemic things, right? I told you that Taylor Swift can't persuade people on abortion or guns. That's probably the same thing with Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, or any other candidate that's out there. Independence of celebrities, right? Might Trump have had an advantage over Clinton as an outsider when he ran in 2016? I have another article, or I should say a chapter in a book called A Hollywood Connection that talks about all of the free coverage that Trump got just because he was a celebrity that Hillary Clinton otherwise had to pay for. But likewise, Clinton was seen as an insider and Trump was an outsider. And there may be a factor going on there as well. And as I said before, results, right? None of these endorsers helped Harris win, and Trump had endorsers too, so it may just be a wash in terms of celebrity endorsement. So we can see celebrities do make a difference, right? They certainly can be influential in terms of gaining attention on an issue, right? They are seen as more credible than politicians are. They can be persuasive on issues, but when it comes to endorsing candidates, we just don't have very much evidence to suggest that they're influential in that particular way.
But I think that the point that you were making that was very important is about celebrities really framing, like working as an agenda setters mostly to talk about issues than endorsing specific candidates.
Yeah,
that's
great.
Yes. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Harvey. And a round of applause.
All right, thanks a lot, and stay safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.